Millionaire pretends to be poor to find a mother for his son. What the cleaning lady did shocked everyone. In today's video, we bring you a truly powerful and emotional story. A wealthy businessman, left alone to raise his little boy after tragedy struck, decided to test the world in a way no one expected. Instead of searching for love among the rich and glamorous, he disguised himself as a poor man, walked the streets with his son, and waited to see who would care when they had nothing. Many ignored them. Some tossed coins without even looking. His son began to lose hope, believing people had no kindness left. But then, a young cleaning lady stopped. Exhausted from work, dressed in simple clothes, she still chose to give them everything she had. She risked her own comfort, defended them, fed them, and even opened her home, never knowing they were wealthy. What happened next stunned everyone. This story isn't about money, it's about kindness, sacrifice, and the true meaning of family. The millionaire who had everything learned a lesson money could never buy, and his son found the mother's love he had been longing for in the most unexpected place. "Come on, Daniel, you're late." Jonathan Strawman stood in the mudroom of his Connecticut home with a paper grocery bag full of old, threadbare clothes. 8-year-old Daniel shuffled in, clutching a ripped t-shirt like it was contraband. "Dad, is this really going to work?" His voice was small, full of that 8-year-old uncertainty that makes a question sound like a plea. "It will," Jonathan said, meeting his son's eyes. "Today we find out who actually has a heart. But why can't we go wearing normal clothes? Because when people see us looking put together, they behave differently. Today, we need to see how they act when they think we have nothing." He handed Daniel the t-shirt, and rubbed a smudge of backyard soil across his own cheek. Daniel tried not to smile, then burst into giggles as Jonathan scruffed his hair until it stuck up in uncooperative clumps. "We look like pirates," Daniel whispered. "Two very hungry pirates," Jonathan replied, forcing a lightness he didn't feel. He tucked a handwritten cardboard sign into his coat, "Please help. Hungry. Anything helps." They took the plainest vehicle in the garage, an old beige sedan that still smelled faintly of winter salt and motor oil, and drove into downtown New Haven. It was a gray morning, the kind that made steam from manholes look like breath from a sleeping giant. They parked 2 blocks from the subway entrance, and walked to a spot beside the stairwell where commuters spilled out in impatient tides. "Remember," Jonathan said, kneeling to Daniel's height, "we're hungry and have no place to sleep. If anyone speaks to you, answer honestly, but keep it simple. And if you feel uncomfortable at any point, we leave. Deal?" "Deal," Daniel said, gripping the cardboard sign. The first wave hit, heels clicking, bike bells, the slap of dress shoes on wet concrete. A woman in a camel coat angled her face away, as if kindness were contagious. A man in a navy suit dropped a quarter without looking. No hello, no question, just a coin clinking into a paper cup. 10 minutes crawled by. Then 30. Daniel's shoulders sank, and his brave mouth tightened. "Dad, people are kinda mean. They're in a hurry," Jonathan said, more to steady himself than to teach a lesson. "But we'll meet someone different. It only takes one." Another hour bled out. Rain freckled their cardboard sign. The cold found the seams in Jonathan's thrift store jacket and settled there. A jogger glanced, then pretended to read a text. A college kid handed over a nickel like he was paying a toll. And then she stopped. She was maybe 26, in a royal blue janitor's uniform, scuffed sneakers, and a canvas tote with a frayed strap. Her face looked like it had met too many early mornings, but her eyes, soft, attentive, belonged to someone who still believed small acts mattered. "You too hungry?" she asked, crouching until she was level with Daniel, unconcerned that the knees of her uniform would pick up the grit of the sidewalk. Daniel nodded, surprised to be seen. "Hold on." She pulled out a worn wallet, thumbed through crumpled bills and a scatter of coins, then counted softly. 10, 12, 14, and 25. She placed the money in Jonathan's palm and closed his fingers around it with both of her hands. "That's everything I've got for the next 2 days," she said gently, eyes returning to Daniel. "But no kid should go hungry." Daniel leaned toward Jonathan and whispered, "She's like Mom in heaven." The sentence landed like an anvil and a blessing. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Thank you, what's your name?" "Julia. Julia Perez." "I'm Jonathan. This is my son Daniel." "Hi, Daniel," she said. "How old are you?" 8. "Nice to meet you, Miss Julia." "What a gentleman." She smiled. "There's a bakery on the corner, get him something warm." She stood, adjusting the strap of her tote. "I'll be late if I don't run. My supervisor is strict." "But I'm off at 6. If you're still here, I'll check on you and see if you need anything else." Jonathan blinked. She'd given them everything in her wallet and promised to come back. Most people wouldn't even meet their eyes. "You're an angel," he said. Julia shook her head. "Nah. People ought to help each other. That's the whole point, right?" She gave Daniel a quick wave and disappeared into the revolving doors of a glass and steel office building. Jonathan waited until the doors swallowed her, then exhaled the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Okay," he murmured. "Let's go." They hustled back to the sedan, changed into their regular clothes in the steamed-up interior, wiped off the dirt, and in 5 minutes were again just a dad and his kid with decent haircuts and clean sneakers. The transformation felt like a magic trick and a confession. "Where are we going?" Daniel asked. "To see where she works." Jonathan started the car. "I want to know who she is when she doesn't think anyone's watching." They parked in a garage across the street and crossed the lobby to the security desk. A guard with linebacker shoulders and a coffee the size of a trophy looked up. His nameplate read Marcus. "Excuse me," Jonathan said. "Which floor does the facilities team use?" "Third," Marcus said, scanning them with a practiced eye. "But they're on shift. I just need to confirm a detail about a service request." Jonathan lied with the quickness of someone who hated doing it. Upstairs, the industrial corridor smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and hot dust. They turned a corner and stopped. Julia stood 10 feet away, speaking to Marcus's counterpart for the floor, another guard in a blazer that didn't fit his personality. "Please, Mr. Marcus," she was saying, "same name, different guy. Don't make them leave. The father and the boy from this morning, they were sitting by the subway. The kid's so little." "You know the rules, Julia," the guard replied, bored and immovable. "No loitering near the exit. It scares tenants." "I understand the rules," she said, voice steady. "But I get off at 6. I'll help them find a place to sleep. Just don't chase them off now. If anyone complains, tell them it was me. I'll take responsibility." Jonathan felt the sting behind his eyes come fast and uninvited. He glanced down. Daniel was already looking up at him, wonder softening his face. "You gave them your lunch money?" the guard asked, surprised despite himself. Julia shrugged. "What was I supposed to do? The kid looked like he hadn't eaten." "You're too soft, Perez. You barely get by yourself. If we don't help when we can," she said, "who will?" The guard sighed, surrendering the way men do when they realize they've already lost. "Fine. They can sit there till your shift ends. If anyone complains, I'll handle it." "Thank you," Julia said, and pushed her cart down the hall. Jonathan and Daniel stepped back behind a column until she passed, then watched her work. The way she straightened a framed print with the touch people reserve for borrowed things. The care she took wiping fingerprints off a conference room door as if the glass were a promise. No shortcuts. No theatrics. Just quiet respect for other people's space. "Dad," Daniel whispered, tugging Jonathan's sleeve. "Are you crying?" Jonathan knelt, pressing his forehead lightly to his son's. "We found her, buddy," he said, voice thick. "The one we were looking for. Someone with a real heart," Daniel whispered back. "Yeah," Jonathan said, standing and watching Julia disappear into another suite. "Someone with a real heart." At exactly 6:03 p.m., the revolving doors of the glass and steel tower spit out Julia Perez in her blue uniform, hair escaping the elastic in gentle curls. She scanned the sidewalk where Jonathan and Daniel had spent the morning. The corner was empty. A flicker of worry crossed her face. Jonathan touched Daniel's shoulder. "No," he said softly. They stepped out from the coffee shop across the street, clean jeans, fresh jackets, hair combed. Julia blinked, taking them in. "You two look different," she said, surprised and a little relieved. "Did you find a place to wash up?" "A friend let us use his shower," Jonathan replied too quickly. The lie tasted chalky. "And we got Daniel's dinner." "Thank you." Daniel lifted a small paper bag as evidence. "I had a cinnamon roll and soup. It was awesome." Julia's smile reached her eyes. "Good. I was worried. Do you have a place to sleep tonight?" Jonathan hesitated. "We're still figuring that out. I'm John Sanders," he added, improvising the alias as it left his mouth. "Been out of work a few months. Trying to keep us afloat." Julia studied father and son. She didn't see the cleaned-up hair and better shoes. She saw the way Daniel leaned into his dad, and how the man's hand hovered, protective, never quite leaving the boy's back. "My apartment's small," she said at last. "But there's a couch. You're welcome to it, just for tonight. Tomorrow we make a plan." Jonathan blinked. "You don't even know us. You were strangers when I met you this morning," Julia said with a shrug. "Now you're a dad and his kid who need a place to sleep." On the bus ride across the river, Daniel pressed his forehead to the window and narrated everything he saw: bodegas with neon signs, teenagers swiveling on BMX bikes, a man walking 3 dogs that all wanted to go opposite directions. Julia greeted the driver by name, lifted a stroller for a mother getting on, and offered her seat to an older woman without ceremony. People on the bus smiled at her. Some called her Jules. Daniel watched all of it like a movie. "Is this where you live?" he asked as they stepped off in a neighborhood of narrow porches and chain-link fences threaded with morning glories. "Fair Haven," Julia said. "Second floor." She keyed them into a tidy entryway that smelled faintly of cumin and lemon cleaner. Upstairs, her place was one long breath of order: 2 sunlit rooms, a mission-style couch, a thrifted rug, a small table with mismatched chairs, and a galley kitchen glowing under a string of warm bulbs. On the windowsill, basil and cilantro leaned toward the last of the light. Family photos, some old, some sun-faded, lined a shelf: a woman with Julia's eyes, a man in a baseball cap, a quinceañera dress that looked like a spun sugar cloud. "Sorry it's little," Julia said, suddenly self-conscious. "But it's clean, and I've got what we need." "It's perfect," Jonathan said, and meant it. "Okay, house rules," Julia added, teasing to keep it from feeling too serious. "Shoes off by the door. Couch is yours. Bathroom down the hall. And I'm going to feed you even if you swear you're not hungry." She tied on an apron and fell into easy motion, rice steaming on the back burner, black beans simmering with onion and garlic, a pan of chicken sizzling in a lime and chili marinade that perfumed the whole apartment. Daniel sat at the table, chin propped on his fists, watching like a TV audience of one. "Miss Julia?" he asked. "Why did you help us?" She stopped sprinkling cilantro and looked at him. "Want the pretty answer or the real one?" "The real one," Daniel said. "Because when I was little," Julia said, voice steady but distant, "people helped me. After my mom died, I lived with an aunt who didn't really want me. Some kind folks at church made sure I ate. A neighbor kept an eye out. A bus driver waited when he saw me running." She plated the chicken and smiled softly. "I told myself that if I ever had a chance to be that person for someone else, I would be." Jonathan felt something tilt inside his chest. He pictured a hospital room 2 years earlier, the bleached light, the beep of monitors. Lila's thin hand gripping his. Lila, with her dry humor and fierce kindness, whispering through a cracked voice, "Promise me one thing. Find Daniel a real mother. Not someone who wants our money, someone who'll love him when no one's watching." He had nodded then, tears he'd refused to cry burning behind his eyes. "I promise." "Dig in," Julia said, setting plates before them. Daniel took one bite and brightened. This is so good. Like superhero good. Julia laughed. Then you must be my official taste tester. She slid a jar of pickled onions onto the table. Try these on top. They ate until the plates were bare and the last of the rice scraped clean. Afterward, Daniel washed dishes while Julia dried, and Jonathan wiped the table and folded the dish towel the way his wife used to, a little ritual that made order out of chaos. The rhythms felt like a family he'd stumbled into by accident and didn't dare name. Later, Julia turned the couch into a bed with crisp sheets that smelled like sun. She handed Daniel a t-shirt that said New Haven Summer League in peeling letters. It's clean, she said. But it's from my cousin, so it might give you basketball powers. Cool, Daniel whispered, eyes wide. She dimmed the lights and sat on the arm of the couch. When I can't sleep, she said, I listen to the sounds my building makes, radiators clanking, someone laughing 3 floors down, the bus braking at the corner. It reminds me that I'm not alone. You aren't either. H to keep her. Will you stay a minute? Daniel asked, small again. Julia nodded and began to hum, a low, steady melody, then sang in a soft, hushed voice, an old lullaby her mother used to sing, words rolling like warm water. Daniel's eyes fluttered and closed. His breathing slowed. Jonathan watched from the doorway, something in him unwinding, something else bracing. When Daniel was asleep, Julia eased to her feet. You can take the chair, Jonathan murmured. I'll be fine on the couch. She waved him off. I've got my room. You rest. He stood there a second too long. Thank you, he said finally. For all of this. For seeing us. Julia tilted her head. Most people just need to be seen, she said. Good night, John. Lights out. The apartment breathed. On the couch, Jonathan stared at the ceiling, tracing hairline cracks like constellations. He heard the building's heartbeat, the pipes, the faraway TV, the night bus sighing at the stop. Somewhere deeper, another sound, older and sharper, his promise to Lila echoing against the quiet. Find Daniel a real mother. In the morning, coffee steamed in 2 mugs on the counter. Julia packed Daniel a paper sack, PB&J cut on the diagonal, an apple, 2 homemade cookies wrapped in wax paper. For later, she said, pressing it into his hands. Are we coming back? Daniel asked, already attached to the idea of here. If your dad wants, Julia said, looking at Jonathan over the boy's head with a question she didn't voice. Are you the kind of man who lets people help you? Jonathan swallowed. The plan had been a one-day test, a social experiment dressed up as a lesson. But experiment felt obscene in the light of Julia's kitchen. This wasn't data. This was a person. He nodded. We'll stop by, he said softly. If it's not a bother. It won't be, Julia said. I make too much rice anyway. On the bus back to downtown, Daniel leaned into his father's side, lunch sack crinkling between them. Dad, he whispered, can we be her family? Jonathan looked out the window at the river, the steel blue sheet of it catching the morning sun. He thought of boardrooms and marble foyers and address plates that said Strawman and CO. He thought of the promise he had made in a room that smelled like antiseptic and goodbye. And he thought of Julia humming in the dark until his son slept. Maybe, he said, and knew, maybe, was already becoming yes. That afternoon bled into days. Jonathan invented a story he could live with: odd jobs, day shifts, a friend's couch. He never said he ran half the cranes on the eastern seaboard, never said the old beige sedan shared a garage with machines worth more than a block of houses. He brought coffee to Julia's break. He fixed a crooked cabinet door. He learned the names of her neighbors, who called across balconies like cousins: Mrs. Rosario with the potted tomatoes, Mr. Anthony's with the harmonica, a teenager named Malik who dribbled a basketball everywhere he went. Daniel learned how to rinse rice until the water ran clear and that cilantro stems have more flavor than the leaves. Nights, when Julia sang, Daniel's eyelids dipped without a fight. Mornings, she tucked snacks into his backpack and told him to listen to his dad. And somewhere between the rice and the lullabies, Jonathan's guarded gratitude bent, then broke, into something he couldn't smother with logic. 3 weeks later, in the quiet before dawn, Jonathan stood at the sink in Julia's kitchen, washing a single mug, watching the thin line of pink lift over the rooftops. He dried the cup and set it down, then reached into his wallet and touched the worn photo of Lila, just once, a benediction. "I'm trying," he whispered to the empty room. "I'm keeping my promise." From the bedroom, Julia's alarm chimed 3 soft notes, then silence. Daniel snored lightly from the couch, a small, contented storm. Jonathan's phone buzzed on the counter, a calendar alert for a board meeting that would start in 4 hours, a different life demanding attendance. He silenced it, pulled on his jacket, and looked back at the small apartment, at the life forming like a Polaroid in warm light. One day soon, he told himself, I'll tell her the truth. And then he wondered, with a fear that felt a lot like hope, whether the truth would be a nug. By late October, the rhythms had settled in like a song everyone knew by heart. Weekdays, Jonathan walked Daniel to school, then headed to odd jobs, which really meant a quiet office where his assistant stacked contracts for strawman development. Afternoons, he found reasons to pass through Fairhaven, hinges to fix, a wobbly table leg to shim, a jar that needed its lid unstuck. Evenings, Julia cooked simple meals that tasted bigger than the ingredients. Nights, she sang Daniel to sleep while Jonathan pretended not to listen from the hall. Back on that first day, when the experiment began, it hadn't been a wife helping him gather old clothes. It had been Mari, the household manager, bustling through the mudroom with a bag of cast-offs. From a distance a stranger might have mistaken her for a spouse. The truth had sharp edges. Lila had been gone 2 years. Jonathan still reached for the space she'd left on the pillow. One Sunday after church let out down the block, Julia opened her windows and turned her kitchen into an orchestra, rice rinsing clear in the colander, black beans simmering with garlic, a skillet snapping with chicken under lime, cumin, and a pinch of chili. Daniel sat on the counter swinging his legs crowned. Official taste tester. "Stir the beans for me, John," Julia said over her shoulder. He obliged, watching the way she moved, economy of motion, nothing wasted, respect for every step. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Always. Why did you help us that day? Really?" Julia set down the knife and leaned on her palms. "Pretty answer or honest?" "Honest. Because people helped me when I had nothing," she said. "My mom died when I was 15. My aunt took me in, but I slept on a fold-out and paid rent in chores. Ladies from church smuggled me groceries. A neighbor taught me to fill out job apps. A bus driver pretended not to see me sprint the last half block so I could catch the route on time." She smiled at Daniel. "The world kept me afloat, one small kindness at a time. If I can be that for somebody else, I will." Daniel beamed. "You're my somebody else." The words hit Jonathan like a clean punch. He set the spoon down and found his voice. "Julia, these last weeks, they've been the best since." He stopped, throat tight. "Since before the hospital." Silence, warm instead of awkward. Julia reached for 2 plates. "Then don't overthink it," she said softly. "Eat while it's hot." They ate, talked, cleared, and drifted up to the roof with paper cups of cinnamon tea. From there, the neighborhood spread out in tidy seams, porch lights popping on, a radio murmuring a ballgame, wind chimes making their quiet argument with the breeze. Daniel rolled a toy car back and forth along the parapet, learning the edge by inches. "You ever think about living somewhere else?" Jonathan asked. Julia lifted a shoulder. "I did. When I was 19, I thought anywhere but here. But this block, Mrs. Rosario's tomatoes, Mr. Antunes's harmonica, Malik practicing jump shots at midnight, this is the family I got when I didn't have one." She glanced at him. "Money moves people into bigger houses. It doesn't always move them closer to anybody." He wanted to tell her everything then. The cranes, the glass towers, the boardroom where his name was burned into mahogany. The promise he'd made in a room that smelled like antiseptic and goodbye. But Daniel set the car on his knee and said around a yawn, "Mama Julia, can you sing?" Jonathan looked up, heart stuttering at the two small words. Julia flushed. "He started that last week," she said quickly. "I told him he didn't have to." "I like it," Daniel said, simple as gravity. They went downstairs. Julia sang. Daniel drifted. Jonathan sat in the chair by the door with a blanket draped around his shoulders and realized the chair felt like home. 3 months after the subway entrance, Jonathan called Julia and asked if she'd meet him for dinner. "Someplace nice, but not fancy. She laughed. "I have exactly one dress. If the place requires 2, we're in trouble." He arrived early at a brick-lined trattoria near the green. White tablecloths, candles and low glasses, a piano murmuring standards in the corner. When Julia walked in, he forgot to stand. Her cobalt dress was simple and perfect. She'd pulled her curls back, and a small gold cross at her throat caught the light when she moved. "Wow," he managed. She laughed, suddenly shy. "It's from a thrift store on Grand. I shouldn't have bought it. I used grocery money." She waved it away. "Anyway, I wanted to look nice for you." The words landed like a gift and a stone. He ordered for them because his hands needed a job. She teased him for picking the same dish as her. They compared favorite school lunches, his, square pizza Fridays. Hers, anything swapped for cookies, worse first jobs. His, mowing estates every summer. Hers, scrubbing fryer hoods at a diner that paid cash in envelopes. Halfway through dessert, the piano player started. "What a wonderful world." Jonathan folded his napkin, smoothed it flat, and decided there was no merciful way to do this. "Julia," he said, "I need to tell you something important. About who I am." She tilted her head. "You sound like you're about to confess to a crime." "In a way," he said. "My name is Jonathan Strawman." She blinked, waiting for the rest. "My family owns Strawman Development. We build high-rises up and down the East Coast." He swallowed. "I'm not a man hunting odd jobs. I'm the opposite." Silence stretched, thin as glass. "And that day by the subway," he continued, words coming faster now that the dam had cracked. "I wasn't actually homeless. I was testing people. It was supposed to be a lesson for Daniel. To see who would stop, who would look us in the eye. It was wrong. I know that now. But you, Julia, you were pretending," she said, voice small and steady as a line carved in stone. 4 months. Yes. No. I mean, after that day it wasn't a test anymore. It was us. It was real. I fell in love with you making rice and singing lullabies and knowing the bus driver's name. She pulled her hand back as if she'd touched a stove. You lied every time you said goodnight. I lied about my job, not my heart. He hated how cheap it sounded even as he said it. I should have told you. I was scared. Of ruining this. Of you thinking that I'd want your money. She finished, the hurt finally showing. So you made me prove I didn't. Over and over. While I bought a dress with grocery money to look nice for you. Julia! You let me open my home. To your son. Her voice wobbled and hardened again. You let him call me Mama Julia while you kept me in the dark. Because he needed you. Jonathan said, desperate and clumsy. Because I needed you. Because when Lila died I promise. I am not an experiment to check against a promise. Julia said, standing so quickly the chair feet squeaked. A couple at the next table looked up. She straightened her shoulders. I'm a person. I gave you everything I had the first day we met. $14.25. And you gave me a story. He stood too, hand out useless. Julia, please. She shook her head, eyes bright. You don't get to decide when the truth is convenient. She set her napkin on the table with careful precision. Tell Daniel I'm sorry I can't say goodnight. By the time he reached the sidewalk, she was already a blue blur at the corner, swallowed by a crosswalk and a stream of taillights. He took 2 steps after her and stopped. Running wouldn't fix it. Words had broken it. Only better words, earned words, might someday mend it. Back at the mansion, Daniel was in the den building a city out of blocks, a police car's siren whooping softly through his teeth. "Did you ask her?" he said without looking up. "Did you tell her the secret?" Jonathan sank to the rug. "I did, buddy." Daniel's hand stilled. "Is Mama Julia mad?" "Yes." "Is she coming over?" "Not tonight." The siren noise died. Daniel stared at the tower he'd built and pushed the top piece off with one finger. It fell, clacked, rolled beneath the couch. "I made it fall," he said, not meaning the blocks. Jonathan gathered his son, police car and all. "This is my fault," he said into Daniel's hair. "Not yours." Upstairs, a door clicked. Jonathan's father, Harrison Strawman, silver hair immaculate, tie loosened exactly 1 inch, stepped into the doorway. "What's this?" he asked, taking in the scene, his heir on the floor, his grandson hiccuping in his arms. "Nothing you need to worry about," Jonathan said. Harrison studied them, eyes cold and exact. "If the boy is crying over that janitor again, perhaps it's time to remember who you are." Jonathan felt Daniel flinch at the word. He stood, son on his hip, and faced the man who'd taught him to measure twice and trust never. "I know exactly who I am," he said. "And I know who she is." Harrison said, calculating. "We'll see." He turned as if to leave, then paused. "Some choices close doors you can't reopen, son. Don't slam one for a fantasy." When the hallway swallowed him, Jonathan stared into the dark pane of the window and saw 2 reflections, a man who'd built a skyline out of steel, and the father who'd just blown up a small, good thing with a handful of bad decisions. In Fairhaven, Julia sat on the edge of her bed in the cobalt dress, shoes kicked into a corner, hands still and empty in her lap. In the kitchen, the clock on the stove clicked from 11:59 to 12 o'clock, and the apartment breathed around her like a living thing. She could still feel a small hand finding hers on a busy sidewalk, still hear a lullaby soft in her own throat. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes until stars came. "I am not an experiment," she whispered to the dark. "I am not an experiment." Across town, Harrison Strawman poured himself a scotch, dialed a number he hadn't used in years, and said into the quiet, "Sonia, I need a favor. Find everything there is to know about a Julia Perez. And then make sure my son forgets her." The morning after the breakup, Harrison Strawman moved like a man executing a corporate takeover, because, in his mind, love was just another hostile asset to neutralize. He stood at the bay window of his Greenwich office, phone tucked to his ear. "Sonia," he said, eyes on the lawn where gardeners clipped hedges with surgical neatness. "I need a discreet placement. Housekeeper. Tell her your name is Sylvia Vale. $3,000 a month, cash. Start immediately." Across town, Julia Perez stared at the blue uniform on her chair and the single cobalt dress hanging from the closet door. She had slept, if it could be called sleep, in 10-minute drops and starts. By noon, the building manager at her day job handed her a thin envelope and a thinner apology. Budget cuts, fewer shifts, maybe call back next month. When the knock came that afternoon. "Ms. Perez? I'm Sylvia. I heard you're reliable." Julia's first instinct was to say no. The second was rent. "Full-time?" she asked. "Weekdays. 8 hours. Big house, but you'll work alone. My husband travels." The woman, polished and forgettable in the way of people who slip into any room, slid a card across the table. "If you can start tomorrow, there's a signing bonus." At 7:55 a.m. the next day, Julia stood at a wrought iron gate off a shaded lane in Old Greenwich. The intercom clicked, a camera blinked. The gate side opened to reveal a whitewashed Georgian that looked like it had opinions about silver polish. Inside, a man in a slate vest and square glasses waited with a legal pad. "I'm Mr. Gilbert," he said without offering a hand. "House manager. You will follow instructions exactly." He led her through rooms that glowed, 12 bedrooms, 8 baths, 3 sitting rooms dressed in creams and blues. "We begin in the dining room," he said. The table is mahogany. No circular motions. Always with the grain. He didn't smile. Julia set her tote down, rolled her sleeves, and went to work. She wiped, dusted, buffed crystal until it caught the morning like rain. An hour later, Mr. Gilbert returned, plucked a non-existent speck from a chair rail, and frowned. Again, he said. Sir, Again. She did it again. And again, when he pointed to a seat 2 degrees off perfect. By noon, her shoulders burned. In the pantry she found the lunch, provided, a wrapped bologna sandwich and a juice box. She ate leaning against the shelf and thought about the way Daniel had picked onions off his taco with grave concentration, about how he'd whispered, "Don't worry, Mama Julia, I can eat the spicy parts now." On day 2, Mr. Gilbert handed her a toothbrush for the bathroom grout. When she finished, he walked in with garden shoes, crossed the wet floor, and left a trail of brown. "You missed a spot," he said. She bit the inside of her cheek and started over. On day 3, he sent her outside to wash windows in the October glare, 2 stories up, ladder braced against the gutter. She cleaned 40 panes, climbed down, and watched him tip a bucket so a ribbon of dirty water snaked across the glass. "Streaks," he said. "Unacceptable." By Friday, Julia's hands shook when she turned the front door knob. In the marble foyer, Mr. Gilbert checked his watch, an antique with a face the color of old honey. "We have a special event tomorrow," he said. "Come at 9. Deep clean the formal rooms. I expect excellence." Saturday morning, the house felt too quiet. No staff. No Sylvia. Just the hum of air through vents and the hush of expensive carpet. Mr. Gilbert hovered as she polished silver and set crystal in tidy militias along the sideboard. At noon he stepped into the living room, removed the gold watch, and set it on a side table with theatrical care. "I'll be right back," he said and left. Julia finished the entry, carried her caddy to the kitchen for fresh towels, and returned to the living room. The watch was gone. She froze, eyes sweeping the rug, the table seams, the couch cushions. Nothing. Her stomach dropped through the ornate parquet. Footsteps. Voices. Mr. Gilbert reappeared, with another man at his shoulder. "Jonathan." He stopped short. "Julia?" She felt the world tilt, fast and wrong. What are you doing here?" "This is my father's house," Jonathan said, confused, already searching her face for a story that would spare them both. Mr. Gilbert didn't give her time to find words. "Excellent you're here, Mr. Strawman," he said crisply. "A concern. I set my watch right there. Now it's missing." Julia blinked. "I just stepped to the kitchen. It must be. We'll simply clear this up." Mr. Gilbert turned to her with a reasonable smile that didn't reach his eyes. "May I check your bag?" Jonathan flinched, the request, the humiliation. "That's not—" "It's fine," Julia said, throat tight. "Go ahead." She picked up her tote with shaking hands and set it on the polished table. Mr. Gilbert unzipped it, lifted a sweater, a wallet, a small jar of Vicks, a bus pass. And then, the watch, gleaming in his palm like a verdict. Silence ate the room. "I didn't put that there," Julia whispered. "I swear to you, Jonathan. I didn't." Mr. Gilbert sighed. "I would never accuse without proof." He held the watch up between 2 fingers, moral sadness poured into posture. Jonathan's face went through 3 expressions in a breath: shock, hurt, something like calculation, and landed on the flat exhaustion of a man who had been warned. "Julia," he said too gently, as if softness could blunt a blade. "Why?" She took 1 step toward him. "You think after everything? You think I would steal from your family?" "It was in your bag," Mr. Gilbert said. She ignored him. "Look at me, Jonathan. Do you believe I would do this?" He opened his mouth. Closed it. "I don't know what to believe." Mr. Gilbert lowered the watch into his vest pocket like a priest putting away a relic. "I'll ensure the matter stays internal," he said, the benevolence oily. No need to involve the police. Out of respect for my employer. Julia's eyes burned. Out of respect, she repeated. How generous. She lifted her tote, every motion precise. I won't work another minute in this house. She turned to Jonathan. You could have asked me anything. You could have trusted me. But your first instinct was to trust him. She nodded at Mr. Gilbert. Whoever he is. Jonathan stepped toward her, a useless reflex. Jules! No, she said, voice steady now. Tell Daniel I love him. Tell him I'm sorry I can't sing tonight. She walked out before the room could shrink. In the foyer, she passed a mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back, uniform rumpled, eyes rimmed red, mouth set in a line that meant survival. Outside, the sky was brittle blue. She made it to the road before the tears came. On the shoulder, she bent double and let them. When she straightened, she felt very old and very clear. She pulled out her phone, blocked Mr. Gilbert's number, though she'd never had it, and started walking toward the bus stop. When the bus doors sighed open, the driver, same one who had watched her sprint in the rain a dozen times, tilted his head in question. She shook hers and sat, one seat from the back, hands folded tight in her lap. Inside the mansion, Harrison Strawman removed the square glasses and the vest in the mudroom and hung them exactly 2 inches apart. He walked into the living room as if he had only just arrived. Son, he said to Jonathan, who was staring at the side table like it owed him an apology. I came as soon as I heard there was an incident. It's handled, Jonathan said, voice far away. She left. Good, Harrison said. An unfortunate episode, but instructive. Jonathan turned. Did you hire her? Harrison arched an eyebrow. The house needed staff. You knew it was Julia. I knew it would be messy if it wasn't. He poured 2 fingers of scotch into a cut glass tumbler. You needed to see who she is. Better now than after she's cost you far more than a watch. Jonathan stared at the glass in his father's hand. You set this up. Harrison sipped. I controlled the environment. That's called prudence. Jonathan opened his mouth, shut it, and felt the last of his certainty topple into a trench he didn't know how to cross. He left without the scotch. That night, in a house that suddenly felt too large, he tucked Daniel into bed. The boy clutched the worn stuffed fox Julia had stitched a crooked heart onto with red thread. Is Mama Julia coming? Daniel asked. Not tonight, Jonathan said, voice thin. Did you tell her the secret? He still called the truth a secret, as if naming it that could make it smaller. Yes. And I made a mess of it. Daniel thought about that, then turned his face to the wall. After a long minute, he said into the pillow, Grandpa doesn't like her. I know. Grandpa says mean things when he thinks nobody hears. The words came out sleep-slurred but careful. Jonathan smoothed his son's hair. What did he say? Nothing, Daniel murmured, suddenly cautious. Night, Dad. After the light clicked off, Daniel lay very still, listening. His new phone, an apology gift that didn't know how to be one, rested in the drawer of his nightstand. Last week he'd discovered the voice memos app and recorded himself singing, the rain on the window, the housekeeper's vacuum making a whale sound in the hall. Today, he'd recorded the way his grandfather's voice changed on the phone, growing flat and sharp as a knife. He didn't know what to do with the thing now sitting under his pillow, a file name that read 4:17 p.m., Grandpa. He only knew it felt like a grown-up kind of secret. Across town, Julia sat at Donna Carmen's kitchen table, hands around a mug of tea that had gone cold. He didn't believe me, she said softly. The older woman slid a plate of food closer. Eat, she said. Then we make a plan. The plan, as it turned out, didn't care what they wanted. On Monday, Julia put on her best smile and knocked on 3 doors for cleaning work. At each, the manager's warmth iced over when they reached her name. By the 4th refusal, the pattern was a bruise. I'm sorry, the owner of a small agency said quietly, sliding her application back. I got a call. From whom? A private number. Said you were trouble? Said you stole? He winced. I don't believe it. But I can't risk losing a client. Julia walked out into noon sun that felt like nothing. At a bus stop, she picked up her phone to call the building where she'd had her regular job and stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. She didn't dial. At the Strawman house, Harrison's voice carried through the study door. Ricardo, it's Harrison, he said into the phone. If Julia Perez shows up anywhere near your roster, you'll lose more than a contract. Spread the word. Discreetly. Daniel, who had come to ask for help with a math problem, froze in the doorway. He edged back behind the hall table, breath small. There's no need to call it a lie. Harrison continued, tone calm, almost bored. Just say you can't recommend her. Or say she stole. It's not untrue. A pause. A soft laugh. Well, not exactly untrue. Daniel's hand went to the drawer in the entry. He flipped open his phone with the fumble of a kid, found the red dot, tapped it, and held his breath. The recording ticked forward, swallowing his grandfather's words whole. He didn't know, not yet, that the small rectangle in his palm had just become the most powerful thing in the house. That evening, Jonathan sat at his desk with the city laid out behind glass and a contract open like a wound. He called Julia twice. The first went to voicemail. The second rang and ended in an empty click. He typed, deleted, typed again, I'm sorry. Let me explain. Please. He didn't hit send. In Fairhaven, Julia lay awake, the ceiling above her bed a map she couldn't read. When she finally slept, it was shallow and full of elevators that never opened. By Wednesday, Daniel had 3 recordings, one with the phrase not exactly untrue, one where Harrison told a man named Dr. Carver, find something or invent it, and one where his father said, tired and honest, I still love her, to the dark of his own office. On Thursday, the child who didn't know what to do with secrets did the only thing his 8-year-old logic could bear. He made a plan to save his family. He put the phone under his pillow and whispered into the cotton, Please let this work. And in a quiet kitchen across the river, Julia poured herself a glass of water and felt the room tilt. She gripped the counter, waited for the world to settle, and told the emptiness, I will not break. Somewhere between those 2 whispered vows, the boy's and the woman's, something shifted. The story started to bend. By mid-November, the house had gone too quiet. Daniel picked at dinners, left Legos half-built, and stared at the gap in the evening where a lullaby used to be. The cough started as a tickle and turned mean. One night his skin felt hot as a stove. By morning his breathing sawed in and out like a dull blade. At urgent care they didn't waste time. He's febrile and retracting, the physician said, already moving. An oxygen cannula, a chest x-ray, a white room that smelled like bleach and fear. Yale New Haven Hospital, pediatrics, cartoons pasted to walls that didn't fool anybody. Jonathan signed forms with a hand that didn't feel like his. Pneumonia, the attending said, scanning labs. We're admitting. He's a tough kid, but he's tired. That evening, under the beep of a monitor and a wash of blue-white light, Daniel slipped in and out of a fever's strange country. When he surfaced, he whispered the same 2 words over and over, a prayer and a plea. Mama Julia. Buddy, Jonathan said, close enough to feel the heat of his son's cheek. Dad's here. Daniel blinked past him, eyes glassy. She sings. Please. The night nurse adjusted the 4 with practiced gentleness. Sometimes kids rally when the person they're asking for shows up, she said without looking up. If you can make that happen, make it happen. Jonathan stepped into the corridor that suddenly felt a mile long and dialed a number he'd been trying not to call. It rang to voicemail. He hung up, grabbed his coat, and ran for the elevator. Fairhaven smelled like wood smoke and cold bread. He pounded up the stairs to Donna Carmen's apartment and knocked until the lock turned. Julia stood there in a gray sweatshirt, hair braided over one shoulder, worry written in the space between her brows. Daniel, Jonathan said, already breathless. He's bad. He's asking for you. Color drained from Julia's face. Is he? Pneumonia. Will you come? Of course. She didn't ask what it meant, didn't bring up watches or lies. She grabbed her keys and a sweater. Dona Carmen pressed a rosary into her palm and said, Go. Run. In the room on 7 West, Daniel lay small in a big bed, a fox with a crooked red thread heart tucked under his arm. When Julia came in, the air changed. She went straight to him, touched the back of her fingers to his temple, and smiled the way sunlight smiles at winter. Hey, mi cielo, she whispered. It's Mama Julia. His eyes opened like it was morning. You came. Did you think I wouldn't? She brushed damp curls off his forehead. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Sing, he breathed. She did. Low and steady, the old lullaby again, vowels soft as felt. The numbers on the monitor settled like a flock of birds coming to rest. The nurse, chart in hand, glanced up and gave a small, astonished nod. Jonathan stood at the foot of the bed with his hands in useless fists, and felt something unclench in his chest he hadn't known was clenched. They kept vigil through the dark. Julia crooned stories about buses and basil plants and neighbors who acted like cousins. Jonathan fetched ice chips and watched her hands move, cool cloth, straightened sheet, a palm on a tiny sternum counting breaths. Around 3 a.m., Daniel slept with his mouth open and a hint of a snore, a sound more beautiful than any symphony. At 5, a resident checked lungs and said, Better. Keep doing whatever you're doing. In the pale first light, Daniel woke properly, eyebrow cocked like a comic. I dreamed you were here, he told Julia. Then I woke up and you were still here. Best kind of dream, she said. He turned serious. Can I tell a secret? With Dad here? Julia looked at Jonathan, then back at Daniel. If you want to. Daniel fished under his pillow and produced his phone like a magician palming a coin. Grandpa says bad things when he thinks no one listens, he murmured. I recorded. His small thumb tapped voice memos. He selected one labeled 4:17 p.m., Grandpa, and hit play. Harrison's voice filled the room, cool, crisp, unmistakable. If Julia Perez shows up on your roster, you'll lose more than a contract. Spread the word. Discreetly. There's no need to call it a lie. Just say she stole. It's not untrue, well. Not exactly untrue. Julia closed her eyes, the hurt landing and then, strangely, lifting, like a weight revealed so it could be put down. Jonathan didn't move. Another tap, a second recording. Dr. Carver, I need a favor. My son's about to marry beneath him. If there's nothing to find, invent something. You've done this before. Silence washed the edges of the bed. Machines hummed. In the slow beat of that quiet, something fundamental in Jonathan rearranged. He looked at Julia, and the old, quiet truth came out like an exhale. I am so sorry, he said. For not believing you. For waiting to tell you. For making you live inside a test you never agreed to. He swallowed. I love you. Not the story I told myself about you. You. Julia kept her hand on Daniel's wrist, feeling the small jump of his pulse. I was going to tell you something when you broke me open at that restaurant, she said, voice steady. But I figured you'd think I was making it up for money. What? Jonathan asked, already afraid of the answer. I'm pregnant. She didn't flinch. 4 months. Daniel lit up like a switch. I'm getting a baby. Then softer. Please don't fight. Jonathan sat down hard and laughed once, a raw, surprised sound that turned into tears. He wiped them with his sleeve, useless. I should have known, he said, about love, about faith, about how much damage a smart man can do when he believes the worst thing first. He looked at Julia. Can we start from the truth? We can try, she said, which was truer and braver than yes. By afternoon, Daniel's fever had broken the way storms break, suddenly, as if they were never there. The attending did the shrug doctors do when something unexplainable looks like grace. If he keeps improving, discharge tomorrow, she said. Good work, team. Team. The word lodged somewhere soft. They took shifts that night, Julia humming while Jonathan dozed in the chair, then trading places so she could stretch her back. In the morning the nurse pulled the 4, Daniel made a face, and the world tilted toward ordinary. "Home," Daniel said, hugging the fox and Julia in the same motion. "But after home we go to Grandpa's house." Jonathan stiffened. "Why?" "Because," Daniel said, meeting his father's eyes with a seriousness that felt older than 8. "We tell the truth where the lies started." An hour later, discharge papers signed and a stuffed animal sticker stuck at an angle on Daniel's gown, they drove to Greenwich. The strawman gates opened like a yawn. Harrison was in his study with the newspaper folded into correct rectangles. He looked up as if surprised, which he wasn't. "What is she doing here?" he asked, voice iced tea, sweet on top, cold underneath. "Listening," Daniel said, stepping forward before either adult could speak. Jonathan set a hand on his son's shoulder. "Dad, we're going to have a conversation, and you're going to let me finish sentences." Harrison's gaze cut to Julia, to the hospital bracelet still looped around Daniel's wrist. "I hope the boy's flu isn't contagious." "It was pneumonia," Julia said evenly. "And he's better." Harrison said. "Well, that's a relief. Now, this intrusion." Daniel lifted the phone and tapped play. "If there's nothing to find, invent something. You've done this before." The room went very still. Harrison's mouth closed over a defense that didn't have time to dress itself. Daniel's thumb hit play again. "It's not untrue, well. Not exactly untrue." Harrison's color changed by degrees, pink to gray, gray to a weathered stone. "You recorded me," he said. "You lied about her," Daniel answered, small voice large with the simple mathematics of right and wrong. Jonathan stepped in. "You engineered a theft. You smeared her name. You cut her off from work, from dignity. You did it because you could. And because somewhere along the way you decided love is a liability." Harrison straightened, reaching for Hoter like a sword. "I protected this family." "You nearly broke it," Jonathan said. "You nearly broke my son." Harrison looked at Julia, at Daniel, at the phone that had betrayed him by telling the truth exactly. Pride warred with panic, with the ancient strawman habit of denying facts until facts gave up. He opted for the move that had worked for him in boardrooms for 40 years. "You've made your point," he said, crisp again. "What do you want?" Julia answered before Jonathan could. "Nothing from you," she said quietly. "Not your money. Not your blessing. Just your distance, unless you learn how to be decent." Harrison's jaw worked. "You think you can bar me from my grandson? You did that yourself," Daniel said, voice wobbling now that it was over. "When you were mean to Mama Julia." The study's old clock ticked like a metronome trying to cut through a fight. Jonathan took a breath he'd been avoiding since he was 22. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You will stop calling around town with your little warnings. You will call the people you called and tell them you were wrong. You will apologize to Julia. If you can't manage that, I will move my family out, and you will see Daniel when he decides to see you. Those are the terms." Harrison laughed once, ugly. "You'd throw away your father over a woman with a broom." "Over character," Jonathan said. "Hers and yours." Harrison looked at Daniel again. The boy stared back, tight-mouthed and brave in a hospital bracelet. Something complicated moved through Harrison's face: shame, quickly masked, anger, too old to help with anything, fear, too new to admit. "I'll make some calls," he said at last. "And the apology?" Jonathan asked. Harrison looked at Julia as if she were an investor to be placated without surrendering an inch. "Ms. Perez, if there were misunderstandings." "Words mean things," Julia said. "You'll find yours." They left him there, framed by leaded glass and bad choices. In the foyer, Julia paused under the chandelier, tilted her head back, and let out a long breath. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, like the first hour after a storm when the gutters still run hard but the sky remembers blue. Daniel slid his hand into Julia's on one side and Jonathan's on the other. "So," he said, practical as a project manager, "when's the wedding?" Jonathan laughed, startled by how easy it was to say it out loud. Soon. Simple, Julia added, smiling at Daniel and then at the man beside her. No chandeliers. No lies. We need a cake, Daniel said. And a song. We have the song, Julia said, squeezing his hand. We've had it all along. On the drive back to Fairhaven, the city unspooled like a ribbon. Jonathan glanced at Julia in the rearview, the profile he knew now by heart, and felt the future line up in his chest like something true finally allowed to speak. Tomorrow there would be logistics, and statements to retract, and a prideful man learning how to say sorry without choking on it. But today there was a boy breathing easy, a woman humming, and a promise kept at last: find my son a real mother. He reached across the console and found Julia's hand. She let him keep it. The wedding day came dressed in sun. St. Anthony's in Fairhaven was simple: wooden pews rubbed smooth by years of hands, paper flowers braided by neighbors, a thrift store lace runner Julia had rinsed and pressed the night before. Donna Carmen fastened the small gold cross at Julia's throat, hands trembling with the privilege. Daniel, in a tiny navy suit and sneakers, checked his pocket for the 10th time to make sure the phone was there. For emergencies, he told himself. Only for truth. Jonathan stood at the front, heart thundering, tie imperfect on purpose because Julia said perfect ties made her nervous. When the doors opened, the sanctuary drew a breath. Julia stepped in on Donna Carmen's arm, 6 months pregnant and incandescent, the cobalt of her dress traded for ivory that fit like a promise. Jonathan forgot to blink. They had made it as simple as they'd sworn: no chandeliers, no string quartet, just Malik from the block playing "What a Wonderful World" on a borrowed sax, and Mrs. Rosario weeping into a tissue she pretended was allergies. The priest smiled at the sight of a neighborhood come to witness itself be kind. "Dearly beloved," he began, and the doors at the back crashed open. Harrison Strawman strode in with 2 men in suits who looked like they carried bad news for a living. He didn't look at Julia. He looked at his son. "This ceremony cannot continue," he said, voice pitched for boardrooms and headlines. One of the men held a manila envelope high, as if it were a warrant. Murmurs broke like surf. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Daniel's fingers closed around the phone. "Dad," Jonathan said, steady. "Don't do this. I'm protecting you," Harrison replied, moving down the aisle. He gestured. The manila envelope opened, pages fanned. "This woman has a record. Debts. A disciplinary mark from a previous employer. You think I'd stand by and watch you chain this family to a liability?" Julia's throat went dry. "Those aren't mine," she said, even before she saw the letterheads. Names of agencies she'd never worked for, dates that didn't match any calendar she'd lived through. The priest raised a hand, but Harrison's men were already showing papers to the front pews. "Look," one intoned. "See for yourselves." Daniel climbed the 2 steps to the altar and planted himself between the adults like a small, determined lighthouse. "Grandpa," he said, voice clear in the stunned quiet, "you promised to stop." Harrison faltered, mask slipping a fraction. "This is for your father's good, Daniel. You'll understand when you're older." Daniel looked at Julia, at Jonathan, at the phone in his hand. "No," he said. "I understand now." He tapped the screen. The sanctuary speakers, patched through to the priest's little microphone and, unbeknownst to Harrison, Bluetooth-enabled, caught the signal when Malik nodded and flipped a switch on the portable amp. Harrison's voice flooded the church, cool and unmistakable. "Dr. Carver, I need a favor. My son's about to marry beneath him. If there's nothing to find, invent something. You've done this before." A collective intake of breath sucked the stained glass light a shade dimmer. Someone whispered, "Invent." Another, "My God!" Harrison went the color of paper. "This is taken out of context," he began, then stopped, because there was no context that made those words decent. Daniel's thumb tapped again. "If the background comes up clean, create a file. Old complaints, unpaid balances, anything that smells. It doesn't need to hold in court. It just needs to slow him down. Silence found the rafters. The two men with the envelope went very still, reconsidering their salaries. Jonathan turned to his father, grief and anger braided tight. Enough, he said. Get out. Harrison's mouth worked, but the room had slipped his control. He turned toward Julia, a glance that should have been apology and wasn't, and toward his grandson, whose face held a clarity he couldn't meet. He left exactly as he'd come, through the back doors, flanked by men who suddenly felt like a bad idea. The priest waited until the echo died, then folded his hands and very gently said, "Shall we continue?" Julia laughed once, a sound halfway to a sob. "Please," she whispered. They turned to each other, palms pressed, as the church remembered how to breathe. Jonathan's vows tumbled rough and honest. "I lied about my name. I never lied about my heart. I promise you no more performances, only presence. No more tests, only trust." Julia's vows were steadier. "I forgive you for the ways you were afraid. I promise to fight with you and for you, to sing when our house is noisy and when it's quiet, to remember this is the family we chose. By the power vested in me by the state of Connecticut," the priest said, eyes bright, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." They kissed, and the neighborhood erupted. Malik riffed the melody into a victory lap. Mrs. Rosario's allergies got worse. Dona Carmen said aloud and to no one, "Gracias." Outside, the steps became a festival. Paper cones of arroz con leche passed down the line. A sheet cake appeared from a cousin's trunk, iced with slightly crooked lilies. Someone taped a Polaroid of the kiss to the church door like a public bulletin of good news. Daniel hugged everyone indiscriminately, and kept one hand in Julia's, as if making sure the world couldn't take her back. 3 weeks later, a knock on the strawman door sounded like a new chapter. Jonathan opened it to a woman with a badge and a kind face. "Detective Carla Santos," she said, stepping in with the permission of a nod. "Is Ms. Perez here?" Julia walked in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Yes. I'm following up on a complaint, falsification of documents, defamation, conspiracy to interfere with employment." Detective Santos set a folder on the coffee table, and tapped it with a single finger. "We received credible recordings, very credible. They came to us via Attorney Mendez." She smiled at Daniel, who had snuck to the doorway and was pretending to be invisible. "My son plays on his kid's soccer team." Julia's knees went a little loose. "I don't want anyone to go to prison," she said, surprising herself with how true it still was. Detective Santos nodded. "You have options. The DA is willing to discuss a deferred prosecution agreement. It would require a public admission of wrongdoing, a retraction of the false allegations, and compensation for damages." She looked from Julia to Jonathan. "If you prefer to proceed to charges, we'll proceed." Jonathan glanced at Julia. She took his hand. "I want this to end without more breaking," she said quietly. "But it has to end with truth." A month later, a full-page statement ran in the New Haven Register and the Greenwich Time. "I, Harrison J. Strawman, retract and apologize for false statements made about Ms. Julia Perez. My actions were wrong. I accept responsibility for the harm caused and will provide financial restitution and support to the Fair Haven Community Center in Ms. Perez's name. HJS." He signed a check that felt like a verdict and a beginning, a 6-figure sum divided between Julia and the neighborhood that had made a family out of strangers. He made calls, real ones this time, to business owners he'd bullied, and said words few had ever heard from his mouth. "I was wrong." Some believed him. Some didn't. The law kept its end of the deal. The paper kept the page up online. He did not come by the house for a while. Pride, like a bad ankle, slows a man down. Life, meanwhile, did what it does when you let it. It moved. Julia's belly rounded and shifted. The baby practiced kicks against her palm like percussion. Daniel learned to scramble eggs without breaking shells and decided he liked cilantro after all. Jonathan kept a tool bag by the door and spent Saturdays fixing things that didn't strictly need fixing because it soothed him to make small broken things right. They set up a nursery in the sunny room that had been a study. The crib came in a flat box with instructions that made Jonathan nostalgic for cranes. He and Daniel assembled it while Julia sat in the doorway with swollen ankles and a satisfaction that glowed out of her like a small lamp. "Dad," Daniel said, tightening a final bolt, "what's the baby's name going to be?" "We'll see who they are when they get here," Julia said. "Names should fit." On a Tuesday in late spring, Harrison called. His voice, stripped of armor, sounded older. "I saw the photo in the paper," he said, Julia at a community dinner ladling soup, Daniel beside her with a ladle of his own. "You look happy." "We are," Jonathan said, a fact that didn't require anyone's permission. Harrison cleared his throat, a man unused to not driving a conversation. "There's a fundraiser at the community center next week. The one named in the statement. May I attend?" "It's not my event to gatekeep," Jonathan said. "But if you come as a neighbor. Not as a strawman." Harrison showed up early, hands empty, for once unaccompanied by anyone paid to stand near him. He listened to speeches without trying to give one. He wrote a second check smaller, with his left hand shaking just enough to make the signature human. He stood before Julia with more humility than he thought his spine could hold and said, barely audible over the room, "I am sorry." Julia studied him. 1,000 versions of a reply flashed and fell away. In the end, she said only, "Thank you. Please be better for Daniel." "I will try," he said, and for once the word try sounded like a plan instead of an excuse. Summer came. The basil on Julia's windowsill went riotous. The Fairhaven basketball court cracked under August, and Malik taught Daniel a crossover that made him feel like lightning. On a bright morning at Yale New Haven, after hours that stretched like taffy and a final push that made the world go silent and loud at once, a baby arrived with a wail that sounded opinionated. "A girl," the nurse announced, laughing. "With her own agenda." Julia cried the good kind of tears. Jonathan kissed her forehead, and then the damp crown of his daughter's head, and then Julia again. Daniel, who had paced the waiting room with Donna Carmen counting ceiling tiles, tiptoed in and stared like he'd discovered a comet. "Hi," he whispered to the bundle. "I'm your brother. I will teach you everything I know." "What's her name?" the nurse asked, pen poised over the form. Julia and Jonathan looked at each other, and the answer was easy. "Lila," they said together. That night, after the parade of nurses and snapshots and texts that said she's perfect because she was, Jonathan stood at the window with his daughter asleep against his chest and watched the city lights prick on. He thought of a late wife's hospital room and a promise made into sterile air. He thought of a sidewalk by a subway entrance, of $14.25 pressed into his hand by a woman with tired eyes and a generous heart. He thought of a boy who had recorded truth because no one else would. He turned back to the bed where Julia slept, one hand unconsciously resting on the empty curve of her stomach, Daniel curled like a parenthesis in the visitor's chair, Fox with the red thread heart wedged beneath his arm. "Hey, Lila," he whispered into the silky whirl of his daughter's hair. "Welcome home. We're not perfect. But we're real." In Fairhaven, neighbors taped a hand-lettered sign to the stoop, "Welcome, baby Lila." Mrs. Rosario set out tomato plants like an offering. Malik promised free saxophone lessons for life to a person who couldn't yet hold a reed. Donna Carmen hung a paper garland across the window that said Familia in glitter. Weeks later, on a Sunday morning that smelled like coffee and pancakes and baby shampoo, Daniel climbed onto the couch between his parents and announced, with the confidence of 8.5, "I think we passed the test." "What test is that?" Julia asked, smiling, rocking Lila with one foot. "The one where you find out who has a real heart," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He tapped his own chest. "You. And Dad. And me. And Mama Lila, too." Jonathan pulled them close, all of them, the way you do when you know what almost wasn't. The house breathed around them, The tick of a content refrigerator, the rush of a bus braking at the corner, the low hum of a lullaby someone was always ready to sing. Outside, the city carried on. Inside, the family did too. No experiments. No disguises. Just the everyday work of love, proven in rice and lullabies, in apologies made and accepted, in a boy's brave recordings and a grandfather learning the long road to decent. It turned out a heart wasn't something you tested for. It was something you used.